I took care of Harvey Lewis for 3 years after he lost his sight. The first thing he did when he regained his vision was propose to Diana Chase, the fiancée who had once humiliated him. I thought he'd simply mistaken her for someone else. Until I overheard his conversation with a friend at a party. "Harvey, did you know it was the maid who's been taking care of you all these years?" "I know." "Then why?" Harvey's tone was casual, almost indifferent. "Have you ever heard the saying? What? The first thing a blind man does when he regains his sight is throw away his cane. She's seen me at my worst, witnessed all my failures. That's why she can only ever be the cane I throw away." I stood silently at the door, never stepping inside. Instead, I turned around, handed in my resignation, and boarded a southbound train with nothing but my savings and the weight of 3 lost years. "Are you sure you want to resign?" Mrs. Lewis, Harvey's mother, looked down at the resignation letter on the table, her expression thoughtful. Clearly, she hadn't expected that in less than half a month, the woman who had once loved her son so deeply would suddenly decide to leave. But there was nothing surprising about it. When love is gone, clinging to it is nothing but futile. I didn't want to lose myself over a man who no longer cared. Standing before her, I nodded. Seeing her silent, I added, "I'm not getting any younger. My parents have been urging me to go home and visit them, and they're hoping I'll settle down and get married soon." Of course, it was all a lie. My parents had passed away 3 years ago, and the so-called home was nothing more than an abandoned, crumbling cabin no one lived in anymore. Mrs. Lewis glanced at me, my faded clothes, my worn-out appearance, and perhaps guilt crept into her heart. She sighed softly. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out a check. "This is $200,000. Think of it as a token of my appreciation. Thank you for taking care of my son." I stared at the check, knowing I had no reason to refuse. She called it a gesture of gratitude. But we both knew the truth. This money was meant to sever the last tie between Harvey and me. The moment I accepted it, there would be nothing left to connect us. I was born in a forgotten little town in the American South, tucked between dense pine forests and endless stretches of wilderness. The town was so small it didn't even make it onto most maps. Just a few rundown houses, dusty dirt roads, and thick woods closing in from 3 sides. The only way out was an old gravel road that kicked up clouds of red dust whenever a car passed. Though that didn't happen often. There was no school in our town. To get an education, you had to ride a creaky old school bus, rattling over 15 miles of bumpy roads to the nearest town. In our family, money was as scarce as rain in August. There were 3 of us kids, but just enough to scrape by for one to attend school. I wasn't the eldest, so I didn't carry the weight of the family's hopes. I wasn't the youngest either, spared and spoiled with extra affection. I was the overlooked middle child, the one easiest to let go. In 8th grade, our class participated in a pen pal program with students from a big city up north. That letter felt like a tiny window to the outside world. I poured all my curiosity and longing into it, filling 2 whole pages with cramped handwriting, brimming with questions. Are there really cars that can carry people for hundreds of miles? Do city kids have to walk as far as we do just to get to school? I never expected a reply. My cousin had spent some time in Atlanta, and she claimed city folks didn't care about kids like me from the sticks. They carried themselves with an air of superiority, looking down on anyone with dust on their shoes. But a month later, a letter arrived. The envelope was crisp and clean, the handwriting neat and precise. Every one of my questions had been answered with patient detail. At the bottom was a simple signature. Harvey. Harvey. I whispered that name over and over, etching it into my heart. In class, I'd scribble it in the corners of my notebook, savoring the way it flowed, soft and rhythmic, like a stream slipping over smooth stones. That letter wasn't the last. We kept writing, sharing glimpses of our lives. He told me he was 2 years older, loved basketball and dogs, and hated practicing penmanship, which I found funny because his handwriting was always flawless. By the time I finished middle school, things at home had gotten worse. My parents decided only one of us could go to high school. To keep it fair, they'd draw lots. But as the middle child, I wasn't even given a chance to draw. I didn't protest. I just buried my face in a thin pillow and cried quietly. With no one to turn to, I poured all my heartbreak into a letter to Harvey. By then, I'd resigned myself to the idea of becoming a housemaid. Another forgotten dream buried beneath the weight of reality. But then a miracle happened. My teacher told me someone had offered to sponsor my high school education. I cried with joy, naively believing I'd been blessed by a kind stranger. Years later, when I was in college, I finally gathered the courage to ask my teacher who that generous person was. She smiled softly and said, almost like it was nothing, "It was Harvey." I froze. My heart pounded like it was trying to escape my chest. Harvey, the boy who talked to me about basketball, dogs, and answered all my childish questions, wasn't just a pen pal. He was the person who'd quietly changed the course of my life. When it came time to choose a university, I didn't hesitate. I applied to the one closest to Harvey's hometown. I told myself it was for better opportunities, for convenience. But deep down I just wanted to find him. To tell him face to face, thank you. To let him know that his letters didn't just answer questions about the world. They saved a lonely, forgotten soul. Young hearts are easily stirred. As I exchanged letters with Harvey, my feelings for him grew alongside an overwhelming curiosity. What did he look like? I had imagined it countless times. The face behind the patient words, the boy who funded my education. Though only 2 years older, his letters carried a maturity that often felt beyond his age, though traces of youthful stubbornness peeked through in small, endearing ways. When I finally followed the address on one of his letters and found his home, nothing was as I had imagined. First, Harvey's family was wealthy, far wealthier than I had ever pictured. Second, Harvey had lost his sight in an accident. The timeline fit perfectly. It was during my senior year of high school, right when his letters had suddenly stopped. After the accident, Harvey spiraled, moody, volatile, and cloaked in darkness. He locked himself in his room, smashing things whenever his temper flared. At first, his mother, Mrs. Lewis, visited him every day. But even the deepest affection wears thin over time. His father, busy with children from other affairs, looked at Harvey's despair with growing indifference, as if contemplating whether to abandon him altogether. Eventually, Mrs. Lewis stopped coming. The household staff grew lazy, avoiding him altogether. Harvey's temper had become too unpredictable, too exhausting. Bit by bit he was left behind, a discarded pawn. When I found out, I was furious. Seeing him like that, broken, abandoned, filled me with both sadness and rage. I started going to his house every day. I cleaned, cooked, and tended to his needs with gentle patience, coaxing him little by little out of his darkness. Mrs. Lewis, seeing that my care for Harvey was genuine, and perhaps knowing I was fresh out of college with no stable income, hired me as Harvey's personal maid. At first, Harvey resented my presence. He tried to scare me off, playing cruel tricks, testing my patience, hoping to drive me away. But I didn't leave. I grew bolder with every setback, refusing to be frightened off. Then came that stormy day. The sky roared with thunder, rain lashing against the windows. I was late getting to his house, delayed by the wind and the flooded roads. Alone in the dark. The booming thunder dragged Harvey back to the memory of the accident that had stolen his sight. Terrified, he curled into a corner, trembling. When I finally found him, his face was ashen, his expression lost, like a stray puppy searching for home. I wrapped my arms around him, softly humming the lullaby my mother used to sing to my little sister. After that day, Harvey never pushed me away again. And so I stayed. For 3 years I poured my heart into caring for him. Harvey slowly regained his confidence and his vision began to improve. 3 years of shared days, quiet companionship, an unspoken understanding. And with that, the feelings I'd tucked away since my youth blossomed. I even started to imagine a future with him. One evening, just before his vision returned, he stared blankly in my direction, his cloudy eyes filled with a fragile kind of hope. His voice was soft, tinged with a vulnerability easy to miss. "When my eyes heal, will you marry me?" There was a subtle plea in his tone, a quiet desperation, laced with a fragile thread of hope. I looked at him, at the face no one could ever refuse, and I nodded without even thinking. Harvey laughed, sweeping me into his arms, spinning me around on the grass, his joy infectious. Later he did propose. But not to me. The day Harvey had his bandages removed after surgery, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep on the bus. When I finally woke up, I realized I'd missed my stop. I hailed a cab and rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding with anticipation, only to find Harvey beaming as he embraced Diana. He tenderly brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his eyes filled with warmth. Then, he pulled out the diamond ring he'd probably been holding onto for a while and proposed with heartfelt sincerity. "Thank you for taking care of me so selflessly these past 3 years." Diana's face flashed with shock for a brief moment before she covered it with her hands. Only she knew whether that expression was bashful joy, or the thrill of getting away with a lie. I knew he'd mistaken her for me. Just as I was about to step forward and explain, Mrs. Lewis stopped me, motioning for me to follow her outside the room. Out in the hallway she got straight to the point. "Sherry, you must realize you and Harvey come from completely different worlds. If it hadn't been for his accident, you two never would have crossed paths." I wanted to argue, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Because she was right. If Harvey had never gone blind, our lives never would have intertwined. Mrs. Lewis continued, her tone calm but cutting. "Of course, I'm not someone who enjoys breaking people apart. If Harvey realizes before the wedding that you're the woman he truly loves, I won't stand in the way. But if he doesn't, then perhaps it's just not meant to be. After all, you know as well as I do, given Harvey's current situation, he needs someone who matches his social standing, someone who can strengthen his position." Her words left no room for protest. I glanced back at the hospital room at Harvey and Diana, their faces glowing with happiness, looking every bit the perfect match. My chest ached. "Why, Harvey, after 3 years, can't you recognize my voice? Do you still not know my name? I've told you more times than I can count. I'm Sherry Smith. Can't you remember that? You could have mistaken anyone else. But why her? I'll never forget the first time I saw you, Harvey. You were sprawled on the ground, desperately feeling around for your fallen sunglasses. And Diana, she crushed them under her heel, towering over you with that smug grin. Look at you, Harvey. You're nothing more than a dog groveling at my feet. And now a blind dog at that. You really thought you were good enough to marry me? You lost your dignity that day, humiliated in front of everyone. In the end, all it took was a little pout, a few tears from Diana to her family, and she marched straight to your house to break off the engagement. Mr. Lewis had already decided to give up on you." Mrs. Lewis's face darkened with shame, but even she had no choice but to swallow her pride. "Have you forgotten all of that, Harvey?" When Mrs. Lewis and I returned to the hospital room, Diana had already accepted Harvey's proposal. She looked at me with smug satisfaction, her chin slightly raised as if she'd just claimed victory. "Go peel me an apple," she commanded, her voice dripping with arrogance. It wasn't about the apple. It was a declaration. "Look at me. No matter how hard you tried, Harvey loves me." A wave of sadness and fury crashed over me. For a brief moment I wanted to turn around and run. But then Harvey's voice cut through the fog of my thoughts. "And who's this?" he asked, glancing in my direction with a puzzled look. Mrs. Lewis didn't miss a beat. "She's the personal maid I hired for you. Very diligent and responsible." Harvey nodded slightly, no suspicion in his eyes. "Since you're the maid and Diana wants an apple, go peel one for her." Just like that. As if I were nothing more than a stranger in his life. A nameless servant. As if the past 3 years had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. I stood frozen for a moment, then slowly picked up an apple and a knife from the bedside table. My fingers trembled slightly as I began to peel. Diana watched me with smug delight, her voice turning sweet and syrupy as she leaned toward Harvey, giggling softly. Harvey gazed at her with warmth in his eyes, his smile gentle and full of affection. That look, it was unfamiliar and devastating. When I finished peeling the apple, I handed it to Diana. She scrunched up her nose, inspecting the apple with thinly veiled disgust. "Harvey," she whined, "have her put on gloves and peel another one. I don't want to eat something her dirty hands have touched." Harvey, eager to please her, didn't hesitate. His face darkened slightly as he turned to me. "Can't you handle something as simple as peeling an apple properly?" I bit the inside of my cheek, fighting back the sting in my eyes. I nodded, my voice catching slightly. "I'm sorry, Miss Chase. I'll redo it." I put on gloves and peeled another apple, trying to steady my shaking hands. But when I handed it to her, she pouted again. "The peel is uneven. I don't eat apples with broken peels." So I picked up another apple. And another. Each time she found a new reason to reject it. Too thick, too thin, not shiny enough. By the time I'd gone through every apple in the room, my hands were numb, my heart even more so. Finally, Diana stretched lazily and sighed. Forget it. I don't really feel like eating an apple anymore. I clenched my jaw so tightly I thought I might crack a tooth. I knew exactly why she was doing this. It was because of Harvey. Back when she'd humiliated him, I was the one who stood up for him time and time again, exposing her cruelty. Now that Harvey had his sight back, and with it his value in the family business, Diana wanted to reclaim him. But I was in the way. The woman who had truly been by his side for 3 years, the one who'd picked him up piece by piece when no one else cared, was nothing more than an obstacle in her path. After Harvey was discharged from the hospital, the Chase family wasted no time. They met with Mrs. Lewis to finalize the wedding arrangements. The date was set for a weekend just 2 weeks away. 2 weeks. That was all the time I had left. The truth was, I didn't want to give up on him. But what I didn't realize was, Harvey had given up on me long before I even knew it. At Harvey's engagement party, one of his friends kept shifting uncomfortably, clearly debating whether to speak up. But guilt has a way of gnawing at a person, and eventually,